Afghanistan, where my son fought 3 times, the number of contractors were greater than the number of actual enlisted troops on the ground. I'm talking about the fact that at the other end of the spectrum, the generals all wind up living in Washington, D.C., making a couple $1 million a year as lobbyists and consultants for who else? The military corporations. And so you have a corporatization of even patriotism now, where the supposed support for patriotic causes and war without end and occupation across the globe has to do with what else? The bottom line. And even there the evangelicals have played the game, pretending that they're really waving the flag and not just doing the bidding of corporate America. And so you have an utterly corrupted political party standing against a Democratic Party that, in my view, does not understand the game as it's being played. Because they're still taking people at face value and answering the questions being asked and or responding to what's being said as if there's not any other agenda at work here. And so it's ridiculous. It's a completely uneven contest because it's like bringing a knife to a boxing match and you keep wondering where all this blood's coming from. You're being stabbed, sucker, and it's going to be fatal unless you stop the fight and say, I'm not fighting knife fighters when I only have the boxing gloves on. This whole thing's corrupt. And so when it comes to a local issue, there's different ways to deal with it. But when it comes to the national issue, my sense is the Democratic Party has to attack the Republican Party and what it's become and expose it. And that has to be the agenda of the Democratic Party. The game has to stop. It would be an equivalent, and I'm not saying it's an equivalent in the sense that they're the same, I'm just using this as an illustration, as if you had been in Germany in the early 1930s, and you kept discussing economic policy as if it was a level playing field with people who just didn't want Jewish train conductors anymore, as if that's what they cared about, and never actually cut to the heart of the debate, which is, are we going to tilt towards fascism and anti-Semitism? And so, discussing a myriad of details, how to fix Social Security, what to do about joblessness, as if that's what the Republicans care about, when they have proved in Congress that what they care about is a program to actually liquidate the U.S. government as we understand it, by their initial actions, and they're not even in the majority with somebody in the White House yet, this new party of radicalized republicanism is foolish and naive. And the Democrats have got to start saying what's happening and telling the truth about it. And I think they'll find a large chunk of the American population with them who have gotten inklings of the extremism, even when it's not explained to them, as we just saw in Mississippi. Mississippi. So if the public in Mississippi that rates 67% pro-life, 100%, 67% pro-life, 100%, when polled on the issue of abortion, votes down this extreme measure, even they can see the extremism and the ridiculousness of where some of these things are leading. But it's only bits and pieces, and what we need is to turn local fights into national fights. And that is, not just talk about the opponent individually, but talk about the direction of the Republican Party and give people a choice. And say, even if these two candidates were absolutely equal in talent and personal integrity, and even shared the same views on issues you care about, and were equally nice, etc., you would still have to fight for the defeat and utter defeat of the Republican candidate in every district, because this party, whether it contains a few decent individuals anymore not being the issue, has been hijacked by a group of people who are about a third of the way to a national agenda that is going to stop America from being America as we understand it. And that has to be laid out on the table. What has to be defeated is not just individual candidates in individual districts, but the Republican Party has to be smacked down hard so that it reforms itself. And if Jack Kemp, who's here tonight listening, there'd be things he'd disagree with, but he would agree with that. Because to allow this party in this condition to triumph on any local election or anywhere else is to allow the beginning of the end of the American system as we know it. You cannot survive 50% of your country having been taken over, if you want to say the Republican Party represents half the country, by a radicalized element that does not have have the good of this country at heart, but is divided into two camps. One group waiting for Jesus to come back, so they don't believe in global warming, and this isn't a joke, they believe it. 68 million copies of the Left Behind books have sold in America. That's a lot of books in the 16 novels worldwide. This isn't 3 people somewhere in Utah staring at the moon and howling. This is a lot of people. 1 million copies of a book is sold talking about techniques, including plumbing devices that you can use on your children to discipline them from the age of 6 months on. 1 million copies is a lot. I have a review in the Huffington Post and Alternet this week about those 2 books, and there's a big national movement that was started out of the United Kingdom trying to get Amazon to drop this one book from its lists. Obviously, they can't read every book they distribute, but it really crosses a line. But not 1,000 copies have sold, not 10,000 copies, 1 million copies. And to my knowledge, I could be wrong, not one major evangelical leader has raised a hue and cry about this in the same way that no major Republican leader told the Republican rank and file where they could take lies about Barack Obama being the Antichrist or not born in America. And so the very fact that the leadership that's supposedly responsible and mainstream does not stand up to the groups that are pushing it further and further in this radicalized direction with a religious agenda masquerading as politics goes to show you that they also are utterly bankrupt. So I want to come back to tonight. The fight that Jay is in is twofold. Sure, it's a normal political fight where you can discuss policy and what are you going to do about jobs and schools and all the rest of it. But it's a second fight. And that is every local fight is now part of the national effort to stop the absolute corruption of the American political system by a group of people who are extreme religionists masquerading as politicians for an absolute ulterior motive. And one of the reasons I got out of the movement was it began to dawn on me as I talked with these people and heard the absolute hatred that was leveled at gay people, at women, at any group they had targeted for part of their agenda, that these folks literally don't like our own country. They say they are patriots, but the country they're loyal to, the flag they wrap themselves in, doesn't represent America as it is, that has unions, women with rights, gay people who can live together or adopt children. The America that they embrace is an America that existed maybe for an eye blink in John Whitford's Bay State Colony for 10 seconds before all sorts of other people arrived and more reason prevailed. If then. And there's an irony even about the Puritan, the affinity with the Puritans. If you brought a Puritan from the Bay State Colony in a village like I live in Newburyport, Massachusetts here tonight, told them what the Republican agenda was and how they're attacking public space and taxes and all the rest, they wouldn't believe you. You were fined if you didn't go to the meeting house and pay the taxes. You had to serve on the Civil Defense Force. Children had to be educated. There was no choice about sharing the commons. Why do you think the green in the center of every village in New England is called the commons? Because it was socialist, I'm sorry to say. They shared the land so that all their cows could graze in one place. And so the Puritans would not be on the side of the free market economic thinking of people like Gary North. They set up socialist communes. Now, they also did other things like burn Pequot Indians to death and so forth and so on. Terrible things. But one thing they got right, and that was you can't have a community without a community, and it can't all be volunteer and private property. You got fined if you built a house. How would this go down with the modern Republican Party? In villages like I grew up in, the reason the houses were all grouped together is you paid a fine and were actually banned from the community if you built a house on a piece of land outside of the village circle. Because then how would you do your duty as a citizen? How would you help your neighbor? How's that for a new thought for the Republican Party? That says that everything has to be private enterprise, unregulated, etc. So even where they touch their own supposed Christian history, there's a falseness to it. Because they only pick and choose the bits they like killing your enemies in the name of God, which is why the Pequot Indians were massacred and burnt to death in a stockade in New England, while Winthrop and his buddies literally stood on the outside of the stockade reading passages from the Old Testament that justified the Israelites' slaughter of the Canaanites to justify what they were doing. So that, Michelle Bachmann and company would have understood perfectly. But other than that, when it comes to community, this melding of so-called evangelical Christianity and an absolute free market capitalist system without bans, as Ayn Rand would have loved, would shock even the Puritans. They'd say, what are you talking about? No publicly funded hospitals, no civil defense force, people who don't pay fair taxes, people who are allowed to build a house anywhere they want instead of in the village zone for common defense and decency and courtesy and caring for your neighbor. You can't have a community this way. And so even in the history of the, quote, Christian era of America that they point back to, the lie is given to this sellout corporate America as we now see in this melding of the social interests of the religious right and where this country's gone. So I want to conclude by saying that tonight, when you think about donating some money to this local campaign, you've got to do two things. You've got to give one chunk that you would give to a local campaign, but if you believe even 10% of what I'm telling you is right, you've got to give more, because what Jay is involved in is a fight against an utterly corrupt political entity that threatens this country. And it threatens this country because if you follow if you follow the presuppositions, the philosophical presuppositions of these groups to its logical conclusion, we will be in a soft American, Disney-fied version, if I can put it that way, of Iran by the time they're done. Sure, it won't literally be Iran, and I'm not saying it will happen, because I, like Jay, am optimistic about the curve of history. But he'd agree with me that there are bumps in that curve. And that it may be towards progress, but it would not continue in that direction if people didn't make rational choices. And one of the rational choices we have to make is that we cannot fight political battles like politics as usual. We have to begin to fight them on a sense of national urgency and mission. And so it isn't a question of some battles you lose, some you win, and then if you win them, you lose them, and you can come back and it all comes around. There are times in history when battles are lost that are so important that it doesn't all just fix itself later. And I can tell you right now that the very fact that the Republican Party is running people like Michelle Bachmann means that there are no more Jack Kemps left in that party, because it would be over their dead body. People like Kemp would not run a fanatic and allow it to happen. He would have stood up and said, we can't have this. Here's what she believes. Here's who her professor was. This is what they taught her. This is what she said in the past. We're fighting a war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda overseas. We don't want to be fighting the same war here under different terminology. And so you can take it as a given that the old Republican Party is dead by the very fact that the, quote, respectable, moderate Republicans, such as they are not telling you what I'm telling you tonight on Meet the Press. And saying, no, we can't go down this road of excluding gay people and women and rolling the clock back. No, we are going to support public education, and we will teach science. They're not there. The National Republican leadership is not making even an iota of an effort to push back against this. They're doing the opposite. They're filling in all these little questionnaires, agreeing point by point by point, so that they can get the primary votes from these same people. And so either they're liars and capitulators and moral cowards, or they are the actual enemy within. But they're one or the other, and that is not an honorable political party. And all political parties have their foibles. But the line has been crossed from foible and normal human weakness to a different situation. And that is that the Republican Party is now a danger to the Republic. And that's a totally different fight. And so I would ask you tonight to fill in that card on your table with this in mind. This isn't just another political fight. This is a congressional candidate doing battle with an ordinary political opponent on one hand, but a national party on the other that is disingenuous to its core at this point, because you know damn well that Mitt Romney and his buddies know exactly what I'm saying is true when it comes to the game they have to play. And they know it. And they know, from their point of view, they're pessimists, they're defeatists. In the best of all worlds, Mitt Romney would like to be like a Jack Kemp, but he knows he can't afford to be now because the party has been sold to the highest bidder, which is Goldman Sachs at one end and the loudest, craziest preachers at the other. And between those two groups, there is no Republican Party. There's a whore. On one end of a Mitt Romney, and at the other end, the actual barefaced, intolerant, true believers that in their hearts believe exactly the same things that the leaders of the Taliban and the mullahs of Iran believe tonight. You just change the names of their gods and you have the same agenda. And between those two choices is no choice. And so tonight, at this fundraising dinner, and going out into this community, you have to win this for the country, and not just your district. And that has to happen across the country tonight. So I urge you to fill this in and do the right thing, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.